welcome to episode 23 of the Offsite podcast, where we chat all things construction and technology. My name's Carlos Cavallo.
And I'm Jason Lancini. Good day, Carlos. How you going?
Yeah, pretty good, thanks. Interesting news yesterday on the HS2 front. The good news is they're going to build Euston Station, so that little leg into London is being done. If it was old at Common, I wouldn't use it, so that's handy. But they have cancelled everything north of Birmingham, so we're spending £32 billion to reduce a train journey by 25 minutes, which doesn't seem like great value for money when you say it like that.
Yeah, you didn't tell me you were going to bring this up, so I didn't even think about what to say regarding HS2, and it needs a trigger warning. But
yeah,
I did hear someone say that like it does. This is a risky conversation point, but it was like, is this essentially the UK saying they don't have the capability to build a train line between London and Manchester?
I have no idea. The worst part of the conference yesterday, so as the Prime Minister actually announcing it, was the trains will continue up to Manchester, but they're going to run on existing lines and not at high speed. So they're just
it's fine.
Trains.
What you get out, everyone pushes a bit, and you just get there in the
end. Yeah, we'll see. So anyway, he did commit to spend the remaining 30-something billion pound on, I quote, hundreds of infrastructure projects. So yeah, let's see how quickly they can go through planning approval.
Or what the hell the saving is then.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Good news, we're not going to spend the extra 20 grand on the car. We're just going to buy 20 grand worth of lollies, Xboxes, and like toys. Like what?
Yeah, wait for the problem to surface again in a few years' time.
Yeah. The last episode last week was one of the first that I've actually listened back to in full, and I've got to say, even I was interested in it. So that's a win.
You don't listen to them back in full?
I can't stand my voice, as with most people that listen to it.
Yeah, to be fair, listening to your own voice that's not good viewing for anyone. But yeah, no, it was a decent episode. So today we have a guest who's a bit of a legend in the planning world.
Whoa.
He's one of the most renowned schedule risk experts in Australia. 20 years experience on major projects, even founded his own application in the planning world called TurboChart. So pretty serious CV. Welcome to the podcast, Santosh. How are you?
Thank you, Carlos. I'm very well, thank you.
Santosh, I was saying to Carlos the other day that you do a lot of schedule risk work for many of the major infrastructure projects across Australia and probably somewhat beyond. And that would probably have the potential to make you have you ever counted up the number of projects that you've worked on or for? Because it's got to be one of the largest numbers out there.
I've never actually put a figure against it. I've certainly tried to put some sort of representation of the type of projects I've been involved in and what stages. I've lost track. I mean, I've been doing schedule risk for well over a decade, and some of them have been very simple, basic. Here's a schedule, run an analysis, and we're not telling you anything else, which is a bit pointless, right up to being very heavily involved. Been very heavily involved in a lot of infrastructure projects from that schedule risk perspective, I guess.
Yeah. So it's very topical because you're almost like your own AI model. Trained on many projects.
Yes. I mean, I'd be careful in saying that, but yeah, I certainly have. I mean, my approach to it is, first of all, I say I'm not a risk manager. I've never been a risk manager. I come from a planning and scheduling background, but my perspective is schedules are quite complex beasts. You know, they have a lot of behavioral things around them, and I think schedule risk often requires an understanding of how a schedule functions and how a schedule behaves to be able to do that risk analysis, and that's where I got interested in it, and that's where my background in planning and scheduling, I think, fit in nicely with doing that risk analysis. But I do explicitly like to say I'm not a risk manager per se.
I guess to kick off the real discussion here, it'd be great if, considering our audience of engineers, what is QRSA in its simplest form?
Right. So QRSA, or quantitative schedule risk analysis, I guess, is an analytical way of assessing how risks can affect schedules. or the program, as we call them here in Australia as well. And it can mean a few different things, right? And the easiest way that I like to explain it to engineers specifically is I generally don't like to approach it from the typical risk perspective of, start diving into probabilities and distribution shapes and things like that. What I like to say to engineers is to say, just tell me how things could change from what you expect, right? And if you view risk as being how things can change, then that actually makes it quite a simple perspective, right? You say, while we're doing this, here are all the things that may happen that makes me think of, what can affect that thing that I'm doing. And if you just look at it simplistically like that, well, that is risk, right? That is risk in a way. Some risks are good, where productivity is achieved or exceeded, things go well, and you may do things faster and cheaper than you thought. And risks can also mean bad things, where negative outcomes, where you're saying it takes longer, it costs more money, you've hit some problems. But the good thing about explaining it that way to engineers is engineers are already doing that. I always like to say engineers, if there's one thing engineers are very good at, it's planning. And that's, not planning as a role, but planning as in the actual function of thinking about what we're doing. And engineers are very good at also thinking, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? What else could happen? It's already in their heads, really. And I guess the job of the schedule risk analyst or the risk analyst in that case is actually to tease that information out and formalize it a little bit more. That's the approach that I like to take, is to say, the smarts and the knowledge is not in me. I'm not the person that's going to be able to tell you how to do your job well.
Yeah. It's like playing out scenarios, right? Which the engineers are good at. I might sound like an idiot now. I've never heard someone talk about risks as good and bad. I've never heard of like a positive risk is like you go faster. Is that me being ignorant, or is that like quite a normal thing?
No, I mean, I think the reason why most people think of risks is because they often hear it in the terms of risks and opportunities. People say, have you got an R and O register?
Yeah.
Right. So people say risks is often perceived as being a threat, and the other side of the equation is an opportunity. But if you look at the definitions of what risk is, like the ISO standards, what they say is risk is uncertainty, right? It's just saying uncertainty, things are unknown or variable, and that can mean good or bad, right? So in pure risk management term, we talk about threats and opportunities, or in some cases both. It can be either side of that equation.
Yeah. So Santosh, I guess to also tie in the question about, Carlos's question about QSRA, we had been having these conversations over and over again with different teams or projects, both UK, Oz, New Zealand, about artificial intelligence, construction, how AI would have any impact on construction. A lot of the conversations then seemed to shift towards schedule and schedule analysis. And we wanted to kind of explore, I guess, where that is, what it is, where it is, from the perspective of someone on the ground delivering a project. Is it something that actually is something I should be aware of today, and what can it do for me? So last week we spoke with Dev, the CEO of Nplan, as like a representative of a vendor of that type of technology. We asked questions around like, what can it do? What can't it do? And one of the areas that he talked about, and obviously that's where their product is around this process of QSRA. So Carlos's question around this schedule risk analysis and QSRA is directly linked to this being an area that some companies are saying that AI can make a difference. So with that in mind, I don't know if you have a general thought about that, and if you are, I guess, from someone on the ground, do you see, maybe if I push you for, are there elements of the process that you run in QSRA on projects that could be assisted conceptually by some form of artificial intelligence, do you reckon?
I think there is definitely an opportunity for it. And, whilst I'm generally a little bit of a skeptic in AI, and not because of AI as in the technology and what it's capable of, but fundamentally from the data or the data that we use, the schedules that we use for that we use for this artificial intelligence is, I just think it's not ready, right? It's just not suitable for it, and we can elaborate on that in a moment. But when you think about what QSRA is, right? What we're doing with QSRA is we're saying, here's a schedule. It gets us from start to end. And it consists of activities, relationships, durations, all that business, right? All that fun stuff. And what we're applying is we're saying, what happens if those things change? Right. So typically what we do with, or what we used to do with QSRA is we used to take durations of activities and modify them. We would say, it's not 10 days, it's 15 days. What does that do to the end date?
Yep.
And we can apply that up and down the schedule, and we use that as a quasi measure for risk, because we're saying, the risk is that those durations may change. Now, to me, that's a very basic or fundamental form of risk analysis. I wouldn't even call it risk analysis, actually, because I would say all you're doing is you're checking the sensitivity of the durations, right? You're saying if durations change, my results are different. In fact, you don't even need a high-paid consultant and fancy technology to come to that conclusion, right? So where AI can fit into it is to say, if you have this huge pool of data and you find similarities in activities and projects, you could potentially tweak durations to understand what impact that had, right? And say, based on my pool of data, here's the average, or P80, as we say, 80% confident duration for that range of activities, and here's the result it's produced. The big problem with it that I see is that I would say, well, that's nice. I mean, that's interesting, but it's not very helpful, because the first thing is, and I put it to you in this position, if you said to an engineer who was responsible for a piece of work that said, your duration of 10 days is wrong, it should be 15 days. The first question they're going to say is, why? Right? Why?
Mm-hmm.
What is it that's going to make it take 15 rather than my 10 that I expect? And that's where I think the whole thing falls over, right? Because first of all, the context that tells you why it's 15, not 10, is just simply not there in schedules. I've lived and breathed schedules for, as Carlos said, for the better part of 2 decades. I understand how people develop schedules and what's contained in schedules. And all we essentially have is descriptions that says, install steel, excavate trench. We have no understanding of what's behind that, right? And that's where I think my comment earlier about the data behind the AI tools is just not ready.
What?
I guess, Santosh, to steelman the opposite case. If I repeat back to you a little bit what you said, is that maybe AI could tell us that it believes that there's a risk of something happening, or a part of our schedules is more risky than another, but it can't. What it struggles to describe at the moment to, let's say, an engineer is why, and maybe even what to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
If that's a kind of fair, bad summarization of you. If I was to steelman the other side, is there always this problem in schedule risk analysis of like unknown unknowns? And the fact that there is a risk, just because you can't describe what it is, because aren't you, I guess, to say another way, if you're only describing all the risks that someone
That
can
know
describe
about.
why
Yep.
it's a risk, that you're only looking at the pool of things that you think about.
For sure. I mean, that's one of these things that we always need to think about is, and what else? And what else is there? What other risks can happen? And you are relying on all those biases that exist. The recency bias, confirmation bias, all those. There's a whole stack of them to provide you the input. The problem again is AI can sift through schedules, but none of that's ever contained in schedule information. There's never. I mean, you can say, here's our planned schedule and here's our actual schedule that we work with. And the difference between the two is never explained anywhere in that schedule data, right? It may be captured somewhere else in a delay register. It may be captured somewhere in the forensic analysis. In fact, that's probably why a whole industry exists for doing that sort of analysis.
Yep.
But certainly if you talk about just XCR or MPP files, it's not there, right? Very rarely would someone go to the diligency of have the diligence to actually put duration change due to XYZ. And that's the big concern. Now, where I think that sort of level of duration analysis does work really well is when you're using schedules at a very macro level. When you're, if you're looking at a very simplistic overall duration for a project, you're saying this piece of highway we plan on 36 months, but based on other information that we have, we know that similar projects are done as 28 to 40, etc. The problem with that is that sort of analysis is okay if you're not in control of those durations. But if you are in control of those durations, if you are charged with the delivery and execution of those projects, you are in control of the work, of the risks, of managing the risks and managing the duration. So just to simply say the duration may change and the result might be different is not good enough. You need to dive a bit deeper to understanding, well, what is it? What is causing that? What potentially? Not to sound pessimistic, but what AI can offer us is to actually start telling us what is that information that we need. Right? If we could produce schedules that contained all these various pieces of information and they could be captured into a repository and used for the future, then what is it? And I think that's, as an industry, we're not there yet. Yeah, certainly not in the scheduling space.
I think, and I think I agree with you. We've had previous conversations to this effect. That, like, there's just there's so much that happens on a project that's captured maybe in a piece of paper, shoved under a supervisor's front seat of their car, that isn't in, like, really isn't in the schedule. And when we spoke to Dev last week, he made this statement of, maybe I prodded him for the statement that, like, you can think of AI as someone that's had lots and lots of experience on hundreds of thousands of projects. But then I said the counter argument last week was that, like, if you were on those projects, you would have had more senses. You would have been in the meetings. You would have been hearing. You would have been seeing, not just like staring at the project through the XCR file. If you look at it through that lens, that, like, okay, maybe an AI has experienced 700,000 projects through the XCR file, it's kind of like they've experienced it but had, like, reduced set of sensors to experience those projects. Is there, like, a case for AI giving, to use another analogy, I'm just stacking analogies on analogies, but to use another analogy, like, if I wanted something beautifully written about me or about my company or about Carlos or something, I could go pay a very experienced writer to write something. It would be great. It'd be expensive. It would take some time. If I want something like average written, I can go ask a large language model. It writes something average. It'll cost me nothing and it will be done instantly. And maybe that's useful in lots of use cases, or maybe there's, like, a hybrid. Is there, like, a case that you can see for projects where maybe they get 80% or 70% of the value for 1/100th of the time or cost?
So I think where this is kind of heading to is this sort of automated schedule generation. Where you're essentially saying, here's a model of what we're building, generate the schedule for me based on predefined steps, libraries that say,
I was more thinking almost the opposite. If we stay in the, like, risk assessment world, we could have this periodic QSRA process with a team of people or one person or an expert or whatever. But maybe between then and the next time we do that, we're making all sorts of decisions about our schedule, and maybe we could use some sort of gut check of how we're affecting things.
It's almost like having a taxonomy or a categorization of potential risks that may affect your project, right? So you're saying you're on a railway project, your potential risks are getting access to track, as the weather is, specialized equipment, commissioning engineers, all that typical kind of stuff. Now, you could very well generate that sort of high level categorization of potential risks. Where we'd have the design delays, you'd have approval delays, all that generic stuff. But my question would be, how practically useful is that? Because, if you're on your project, it's for someone to say design approvals are always a problem. Say, well, yes, we know that, right? But how is that going to affect my project specifically? And that's where you kind of need some information that essentially would say, based on all these parameters, your risks would look like this. Now, my question to you is, where is that knowledge coming from? It certainly isn't in schedules. That's the big problem that we have is, when you think about what schedules are, right? They're conceptual models. They're essentially just a model. You may have heard that expression, a map is not the territory, right? So a schedule is not a factual statement of what will happen and should never be treated that way. It's it is just a guide or if you want to be really, really negative about it, you say it's a best guess, right? You need something that then says, right, to improve this schedule, you need to understand what are all the things that could vary. What are all the things that can happen that you don't expect? It would be fantastic to be able to pull something off a shelf, or in the digital world, you tap into a
Yep.
database that says, here are the typical type of risks on your type of projects based on your specific project, based on some parametric sort of values. Here's how those risks could manifest. And I think that would be a spectacularly useful product or a useful tool set to have. I just don't think schedules are the source of that information.
Yeah, right. So like, yeah, so my optimistic view of Santosh comes and helps us do a QSRA at this point on a project, and at the same time we run our little AI model to look at the risk, and that we consider that kind of like the baseline. We compare, okay, it says this much risk on the project. Santosh has done like a real world human version of it, and then in 2 months' time, we try and make changes to the plan. And okay, the end date might have come in a week, but like it's saying risk has gone through the roof. Maybe we should tread carefully. That's kind of you're saying like that's lovely, Jason. But if you're just relying on the schedule data, you might as well just shake the magic 8 ball and say, I don't know what the normal things of the magic 8 ball said, but that you get the idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
All signs point to yes.
I mean, really, if all you're just saying is, let's adjust the durations and see where the answer is, it goes back to understanding why. Now, the beauty of the way QSRA has evolved is we are moving towards methods that are not just about just adjust durations. We always need to give an explanation as to why. Like, when you're saying your 10 days may grow to be 15 days, let's not just put that as schedule uncertainty. Let's actually give you a reason for why that happens. And we can trace back to all those reasons. Now, obviously, we still have that issue where we're saying, well, have we captured all the right reasons, and have we captured those risks with the right numbers, right? But that is a significant step forward compared to what we used to do a decade ago, where we would just put plus and minus values on durations. And certainly some industry bodies have moved into that, what we call a risk driver approach that says, based on your analysis, the driving risks are the following items, right? And we can do that now with the technology that we have. That's not AI in any way. Where I think you could use AI as a double check or a sanity check. But again, it goes back to my point where if you're presenting those results of an AI analysis to a team of people responsible for delivering the work, and they say AI is telling us that you should allow an extra 3 months, their first question is going to be, why?
Yeah.
And they will want to know why, because they're the ones responsible for doing everything they can to not extend that project by 3 months. Right. So
yeah, if you're asking me to allow 3 months for unknown reasons, I might as well run the gauntlet and see if it is going to take 3 months.
Yeah, I'll save you a lot of time and effort and just do the typical 12.5% contingency factor. And there's a number of, even the way that I see even schedule analysis, and this is not something new to AI. This has even happened. This has been happening for the last decade or so, ever since someone looked at an XCR file and said, there's thousands and hundreds and thousands of rows of data here that we can suck into these wonderful tools to pull out all this information. It's like fossicking for the golden nugget, hoping that something in there will reveal, this is the reason why your project will fail, because you didn't put the right type of links in. That's not the case. It's just not true. The schedule is just a model. We use the schedule to help guide us make decisions. The quality of that information is where I think we have a problem. But it's better than nothing, and the thing to keep in mind, Jason, you're very aware of this, that the benefit of planning and scheduling a project is not the schedule. It's the process you go through to develop that schedule, right? So it's getting the people to think about it. It's challenging those people's assumptions, challenging them. Do you realize that you can't do this because that over there is happening? Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, okay. Well, now you do, right? That's the actual benefit. The schedule is just a byproduct, really.
If we think about touching back on your point of like the information isn't in the schedule, so we want to know specifically like what the risk is and ideally what the best mitigation measures are based on history, which is that sort of
Yeah.
experience aspect. Is it the fact that we just don't add that information to schedule? Is it a limitation of schedules? Is it the fact that these applications don't pull data from other sources as well as the schedule, which could be coded in a way to provide that sort of link? What do you think is that limiting factor at the moment as to why we can't do that?
I think it's a bit of both, definitely, Carlos. I mean, first of all, when you think about the way developed schedules is schedules consist of activities that represent scope of work, right? Each activity or each bar or each activity that you see on a schedule represents effort. And for us to actually sit down and explain what that activity represents, you'd be writing an essay, for almost, there'd be a work method statement for every activity. So we don't do that. That's why we install pipe, right? That's the level of the information that we go to. But what we also then don't do is maintain that information very well. Like when we say install pipe, but we hit service while doing, we don't put that type of information. A simple step might be, to tag it to a delay register or tag it to something. And I think this is where technology can fit into it, is to say that the schedule is not just the schedule. It needs to be this repository of connected information. One of my classic examples that I often draw upon is someone might say, look, this 10-day task in your planned has actually turned into a 15-day task in your actual. And there'll be this big hoorah about that's 5 days longer than you took, this delay. And it'll take someone to just go, hang on, it rained for 5 days. That information is not captured in the schedule. It doesn't specifically say 5 days was lost due to rain. But if you went through site diaries, if you went through, the superintendent's records, you might find, geez, this whole week we lost because of rain. It still took us only 10 days to do the actual work. So we were actually as productive as we planned to be. And again, that's a very simple example of where schedules just don't tell you that information. But if we had the connected pieces of data, you could quite easily tease that information out.
Yeah, you need to be scraping everything to form this overall narrative of a project to then give that real context as to
Absolutely.
why the plan changed and what we did.
And I think it's worth doing because when you think about what the schedule represents on a project, it's the only tool that we have for time phasing information. When you think about what a schedules get used for, it gets used for resource loading, it used for cost loading, our sequencing of work, our communication. A schedule is rarely just one thing used for one purpose. So if there's anything that we should be spending a lot of effort to improve the quality of, it's the way that the schedules are generated. But that takes me to another angle, which I put on all this, which is, and I touched upon it earlier, that the value in the schedule is not the schedule itself, but the process that it generates, the thinking and the communication that it generates. And so to me, I mean, you guys may have heard of things like the DCMA 14-point checklist. It's like, we run all these metrics.
Oh, it's Carlos's favorite thing. Yeah, Carlos, you love the 14-point.
I mean, we've gotten to a point. Well, we've gotten to a point where I've seen instances where that is the sole measure of how good a schedule is, and that really shouldn't be the case.
I've been exactly there.
Yeah, and it's like it's one of these
no lags.
Your project will fail because you have 10 activities with high float. To me, and this is something I read by a guy called Murray Wolf a long time ago. He wrote a book that called Faster Construction Projects Using CPM Scheduling. And to put it in a nutshell, he said, there's only one good measure of a schedule. There's only one measure of a good schedule. Sorry. That is it being used? Right. That's it. Simple as that. Right. If people are using your schedule, then that's a good outcome. If they're not using your schedule, it could be for a vast number of reasons, but that's not. Yeah. And that's kind of, it goes back to my point that, the schedule as an object is not as valuable as the method or the process that sits around it.
it's a very loose abstraction of what actually
Yeah,
happened
it
on the
is.
project.
Yeah, and I mean, and the other little thing that I like to always like make fun of is very rarely does a project run on one schedule, right? And I think you guys are across this very
Yeah.
well as well. I mean, and you think about how many different, and I don't just mean, there's one schedule that gets used to manage the, by the executive team, and one schedule to develop, used by the delivery team, and one schedule, for the 3-week lookouts. I don't mean in that sense either. There's also there's any given point in time, there's 15 different scenarios of the potential of, ways that we're going to,
Every, every project, I think without a fail, every project that we onboard as a company, there's always someone in the planning team that says, we can't, we might need to hold off on a week before we import into Apex, because we're currently going through a rebaselining exercise. Like everybody is going through, is constantly going through a rebaselining exercise.
When you're using your typical, office spreadsheet type documents, Rev 1, Rev 1AB, Rev 1A, draft X, the schedules are exactly the same. At any given point in time, there can be a multitude of schedules on a project. And so that's why I always say, the joke that I always say is, the first thing you need to do is identify which is the schedule that you're going to be checking, or using for this analysis. So come back to me when you've identified which is the one you want to use.
I was just going to say, Carlos, that I wonder how well if you're consuming those schedules en masse as a model, how do you even pick apart the ones that are not versioned schedules of the real schedule, and how many of them are just like what if schedules that are sat in the P6 database that someone's gone and just like on a whim made? Like,
yeah, and the what
that's an
if ones are
interesting
going
thought.
to be the extreme good and bad,
wow.
right? So you're going to be yeah.
I mean, if you look at it if you looked at it as pure data, right? You could potentially have two schedules, exactly the same number of activities, exactly the same number of, activity IDs, even the same descriptions with slightly modified durations between the two, and they can produce vastly different outcomes, right? But from a pure data difference, you'd probably look at the two and think they were exactly the same. All you'd have is the difference in durations, but behind it, there'd be a whole, there's be a whole different set of reasoning of why those durations are different. I mean, here's a really simple one: wet versus dry programs, or wet versus dry schedules. How would the machine know the difference other than being able to say, well, one calendar is different to another calendar? And these are all problems that can be solved. They're not, they're not challenging problems from a data and analytics perspective, but it goes back to why and understanding why. Have you got the understanding of saying, well, there's a difference in calendars, and here's the reason why? Because I can tell you one thing: XER files don't tell you why those calendars have days marked as work days and not work days.
Yeah. I have one last question, Carlos, if we can let me fit it in.
Yeah, go on.
So there's a podcast that I listen to where they talk about how writers are scared about losing their jobs to AI, and the common phrase that is said is that, like, the writers are not going to lose their job to AI; they're going to lose their job to another writer that knows how to use AI. And so from the perspective of people doing, whether it's a risk manager or people doing schedule risk analysis at the moment, do you see a world where like the AI is kind of like a co-pilot assistant, that type of thing, to the human process?
I absolutely think so. I mean, we're doing it already in a way in lots of other aspects of our day-to-day jobs. There's so many ways that AI can be used to do things, quicker and easier than already. I mean, maybe not in the sense of generating schedules and cost estimates and all of that yet, but it will get there. The biggest fear I have with AI is not AI itself, but what it's going to do in terms of gaining that experience. We're saying, AI will do all the grunt work and the easy work for you, so you can focus on the value adding work. But, and I think I've posted something about this previously where I've said, but doing that grunt work and those menial tasks is how I believe I actually gain that experience to understand what's right and what's wrong. And if you're going to take that away from someone, they can't instantly become graduates with 20 years experience. What happens in 10 years time?
You go from an experienced person that's being assisted by AI to someone that is basically just like
beholden to it. Yeah.
What does the God box say?
And the thing is, we're assuming that the AI will be able to give the right answers, and the biggest risk we've seen certainly with things like ChatGPT at the moment is how confidently incorrect they can be. And if you're not experienced enough to understand that it's confidently incorrect, you'll just look at the confidence and say, well, that must be the case.
Confidently incorrect is my nickname internally, Santosh. So that's a good spot to end it on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is time. Santosh, thank you very much for coming on. I appreciate your time. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening.